You have a pension, Dad. You don't need that much money. That was what my daughter said when I asked her why the joint savings account, the account I had named the Africa Fund back in 2015 when I began planning in earnest, was showing a balance of zero, not lower, not a small amount remaining, but a clean, round zero, accompanied by a single transaction 3 days earlier. In-branch withdrawal, $500,000. I discovered this on Monday morning, September 15th, at 6:45, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee watching San Francisco Bay slowly brighten, opening the banking app to check the balance as I did every morning. The habit I had built from years of saving every dollar and wanting to watch the number grow month by month as proof that the plan I was working toward was real. My name is Richard James Holloway. I am 69 years old. I taught biology at Galileo High School in San Francisco for 34 years before retiring in 2018. In those 34 years and the years since retiring, I had saved $500,000. Not through clever stock picks or an inheritance, but by not buying a new car, not taking luxury vacations, not upgrading my phone every year, and never once thinking I was giving up too much. Because I knew exactly what I was saving for. $500,000 to carry out a long-term volunteer teaching stint in Kenya, teaching science to students in rural schools, helping set up simple laboratories, contributing to a STEM education project I had been following and supporting from a distance for 10 years. Not a 2-week volunteer tourism trip of the fashionable kind, but 3 years, possibly 5, and of genuinely living and working in that community. And on Monday, September 15th, at 6:45 in the morning, all of that was gone. I looked at the phone screen for about 10 seconds, set the phone down, stood up, walked to the window, looked out at San Francisco Bay, the Golden Gate Bridge in the early haze, Alcatraz small in the distance, the first ferries moving. I asked myself, is what just happened real? I went back, picked up the phone, checked again. Same screen, same zero. Same transaction from September 12th. In-branch withdrawal, $500,000. The account was held jointly between me and Angela, my daughter, 42, living in Marin County. A joint account in the sense that both of us had access, but the money inside it was money I had accumulated across my entire life. I called Angela Tuesday morning, not Monday. On Monday, I needed a full day to think, to confirm the information with the bank, and to make sure I fully understood what had happened before speaking with my daughter. The call was at 9 Tuesday morning, September 16th. Angela answered on the third ring, not because she was busy, I sensed, but because she was deciding whether to answer at all. Dad, her voice carried something I can only describe as readiness. Not readiness to explain, but readiness to defend. You saw the account. Angela, $500,000, I said. Explain it to me. Dad, Derek is in very serious trouble. His company went bankrupt. The creditors are coming. I had to pay them. Her voice was faster in the rhythm of someone who has rehearsed this section many times. I know you had the Africa plan, but you're 69 now. You have a pension to live on. You don't need that much money. I needed this more than you did. I sat in the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and let that sentence arrive fully. I needed this more than you did. Not, I'm sorry, not, I should have talked to you first. Not, I'll pay it back. But the reason why taking it was reasonable. Angela, that was 34 years of savings. You put my name on the account, she said. That means you trusted me. It meant I needed you to be able to access it in an emergency, I said. Not to withdraw the entire account on your own. This was an emergency, Angela said. You think you understand, but you don't understand the pressure Derek and I are under. Angela, please return the money. There was a silence, and then she said something I will never forget. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it showed she had thought about this and prepared it as a weapon. If you sue me or make a scene about this, I'll stop you from seeing Lily. I'll tell Lily that her grandfather doesn't want to see her. I have that right. Lily, my 9-year-old granddaughter, the child who visited me twice a month and often fell asleep on the sofa while I read nearby. I sat in the kitchen with the phone and looked out at San Francisco Bay. The Golden Gate, Alcatraz, the ferries. Angela, I said, I'm going to contact an attorney. She hung up. I need to tell about something else before continuing. Something Angela didn't know. Not because I had hidden it, but because I had never felt the need to say it. In the nightstand drawer beside my bed is a pale yellow envelope, faded by the years. Inside is a letter from my mother, Dorothy Holloway, who died in 2013 while I was teaching at Galileo. And Angela was working in marketing at a small advertising firm in the Mission District. My mother didn't have much money. She was a nurse for 40 years, raised me alone after my father left when I was 8, and had saved about $40,000 which she left to me. But alongside that money was the letter. She wrote, Richard, this is the money you and your father never had, but you made up for it with your whole life. I'm not leaving this for ordinary expenses. I know you've wanted to go to Africa to teach since you first mentioned it when you were 45. This is the first piece of that fund. Go, Richard. Go and don't let anyone stop you. Love, Mom. The $40,000 from my mother was the first seed of the $500,000. 11 more years of saving was the rest. Tuesday morning, after hanging up with Angela, I sat and looked at the yellow envelope in my hand. I had picked it up not because I needed to read it again. I knew every word by heart. But because I needed to feel its weight. Not a heavy weight, only paper and ink, but enough to keep me where I needed to be. I put the envelope back in the drawer, stood up, put on my jacket, and went to find an attorney. Dorothy May Holloway was born in 1927 in Birmingham, Alabama, in a Methodist African-American family. She trained as a nurse at a medical college in Nashville, then moved to Oakland in 1953, when employment opportunities in the Bay Area were better than in the South. She met my father in 1954, married in 1955, the same year I was born. When my father left in 1963, my mother had no clearly good option. Raising an 8-year-old son alone on a nurse's salary, renting with no family nearby because her family was in Alabama and she had no money for travel. What she had was stable work, discipline built from childhood, and a determination that couldn't be explained by any logic except the logic of someone who had decided not to collapse. My mother raised me not by performing sacrifice as something that needed to be recognized and acknowledged. Yet she raised me by living so normally it was remarkable. Getting up early, working, cooking, checking my schoolwork, sleeping, repeating. No complaining, without letting the real difficulties of life become an excuse for not doing what needed to be done. I didn't know what she had endured until I was old enough to look back and calculate. A nurse's salary in Oakland in the 60s and 70s, rent, living costs for 2 people, my partial college tuition, and everything else she never listed. She didn't talk about money the way people talk about burden. She talked about money the way people talk about something that needs practical management, not lamentation. One time only I saw her cry about money. When I was 16, when an unexpected medical bill nearly drained her account. I stood in the doorway, watching her sit at the kitchen table with papers in front of her, her shoulders slightly shaking. She didn't know I was watching. The next morning, she got up as usual, made coffee, and told me to study because there was a test next week. I never forgot that night and that next morning. Not because it was harsh, life is difficult sometimes, that's reality, but because I saw in it something I wouldn't have a name for until later. The self-respect of someone who knows she is doing the right thing even when no one is guaranteeing the outcome will be good. In 2013, when she died at 86 in Kaiser Hospital in Oakland, I sat beside her bed for several days at the end. She was lucid almost until the very last. One afternoon, she looked at me and said, Richard, I know you still want to go to Africa. I startled, not because she knew that, but because she suddenly said it out loud after so many years without mentioning it. You've known since when? Since you told me about the book in 2008, she said. You didn't think I was listening, but I was. She was quiet for a moment. Go, Richard. When I'm no longer here, go. You don't need to be here taking care of me." That made me cry. The first time I had cried in front of her in many years. Not from sadness, but because of the kind of person she was. Even then, even knowing she was dying, what she wanted to say to me was about my future, not her grief. "Mom, I don't have enough money yet," I said. "Then save more," she said gently in the tone of someone who didn't see why this was complicated. "I have a little money left, and take it and use it for that." My mother's $40,000 was the first seed of the Africa Fund. The letter she wrote alongside it was what I held in my hands that Monday morning, sitting looking at the zero on the phone screen. I read the book in January 2008, sitting in the living room alone on a San Francisco winter evening. It wasn't a famous book or one people often mention. It was the memoir of a British teacher who had spent the last 10 years of his life teaching in rural Kenyan schools, writing about students, about lessons with no electricity, about children who walked 10 miles a day to reach the classroom because they knew education was the one thing no one could take from them. I read it in a single night, set it down, sat in the dark for a while. Then I took out a composition notebook, the kind I had used for lesson planning over many years, and began to write. Not a specific plan, but what I wanted. And I wrote for half an hour and ended with one sentence. "I want to teach in Kenya before I can no longer do that." That wasn't a dramatic, life-changing moment, the kind in stories where everything flips in an instant. I didn't sell the house or quit the next morning. I only wrote that sentence and understood that it was true. True in the particular way that not everything you want is real. Some things people want are reflexive, things that will fade in a week. This didn't fade. From 2008 to 2018, when I retired, 10 years, I did three things simultaneously. Kept teaching, saved money, and built connections with the Kenyan education organization I wanted to work with. Not simple email contact. I visited Kenya twice in that period, once in 2011 and again in 2015, to understand the reality before making a commitment. Perhaps the 2015 trip was the more important one. I went to Kamau Primary School in Kayambu County, a small school with 6 classrooms that lacked nearly everything except dedicated teachers and hardworking students. I sat in a classroom watching a teacher named Wanjiku teach science using handmade tools, watching 10-year-old children sit up straight and pay attention in a way you rarely see from American 10-year-olds. I went back to San Francisco and opened a new savings account, named it the Africa Fund, transferred my mother's $40,000 into it, just received after her death in 2013, and began saving more each month. Not because I was forced to, but because I finally had the clearest purpose of my life. Angela Crawford Holloway. She kept both my surname and her mother's. Grew up in the Sunset District house and then in Inner Richmond. The only child of a teacher and a woman who worked at small marketing companies. Linda and I weren't wealthy, but we didn't let Angela go without anything important. Not everything she wanted, and we were parents clear-eyed enough to distinguish between need and want, but enough that she studied well, had time for extracurricular activities, and didn't have to think about money the way children in genuinely difficult households do. Angela was smart and socially gifted, that was clear early. She attended the University of San Francisco on a partial scholarship, graduated in communications in 2004, and went into marketing. She was good at it in the sense of results and advancement, and after 10 years became marketing director at a mid-sized company in Marin County. She met Derek Marsh in 2011, a charming, confident man with the voice of someone who knows how to make people feel they've just heard the most interesting thing they've ever heard. Derek was in business in a way I never fully understood. Not because I couldn't follow it, but because every time I asked him to explain specifically, the answer sounded more like a sales presentation than a real answer. They married in 2013. Lily was born in 2015. I didn't like Derek from the beginning. Not because I disliked successful or confident people. I had many such friends. But because something in the way Derek treated Angela was something I couldn't name until I had seen enough evidence. He didn't consider her opinions. He made decisions and Angela followed. And when I occasionally asked Angela about their major financial decisions, the answer always began with, Derek thinks. I said that to Angela once, only once, around 2017. She said, You don't understand Derek, and you don't understand our relationship. I said nothing more. Not because I was wrong, but because I knew this wasn't the kind of moment when people change their minds. This was the kind of recognition that had to come from their own experience, not from someone else's words. I hoped I was wrong about Derek. In 2023, when she called and said his company was in serious trouble and they needed money urgently, I not lent, $20,000 from my personal savings, not from the Africa Fund. You don't need to pay this back, I said, but this is everything I can give. In 2024, Angela drained the Africa Fund. I asked myself, where did I go wrong? Did I fail to teach her enough about limits? Did I give too much and teach that asking enough times gets results? Did I not speak clearly enough about what the Africa Fund meant? Or is it simply that nothing I could have done differently would have mattered, because this was Angela's decision, not mine? I don't have a complete answer, but I know the question, where did I go wrong, doesn't change the reality that needed handling. $500,000 was gone, and I needed to get it back. 34 years of teaching biology at Galileo High School, a school in San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood where students came from more than 20 languages and family circumstances, ranging from comfortable to difficult, taught me things no curriculum contains. The first, every student can learn, but not all in the same way. That understanding came to me in my third year of teaching when I had a student named Marcus Bell. The boy who sat in the back row never looked at the board, consistently low scores. One day I asked him about an insect crawling on the classroom window. He described it with more detail and precision than anyone else in the room. It turned out he knew a great deal about nature, from fishing and hiking with his grandfather in Marin. He couldn't learn from books because he learned by doing, by observing, and by questions that arose from real experience. From Marcus Bell, I changed how I taught. Not only theory on the board, but experiments, observation, questions rooted in real things before arriving at theory for explanation. My class scores rose not because I became easier, but because I was teaching better. The second, the best teachers aren't those with the most knowledge, but those who create environments where students aren't afraid not to know. The safest classroom is one where I don't understand is heard as a valid question, not a confession of failure. It took me about 5 years to build that environment in my classroom. The third, and this connects directly to Kenya, is that the students at Galileo High didn't lack ability. Many lacked opportunity, resources, and someone who believed in them long enough for them to believe in themselves. The years of teaching there showed me that investing in a child's education isn't charity. It's an investment in the future of the community that child will contribute to. When I read the book about the British teacher in Kenya in 2008, what moved me most wasn't the landscape or culture or geographic difference. It was the sentence he wrote about a student named John. John walks 12 miles a day to get to school. When I asked why, he said, "Because the teacher is here." That sentence changed the way I see my work. I had taught for 34 years, but never had a student who walked 12 miles to my classroom. That sentence made me realize I hadn't yet tried everything my profession made possible. I need to say more about the joint account and my decision to add Angela's name, because that decision is one I look back on and see clearly what went wrong and why. In 2016, after Lily had been born a year and I was becoming aware of age in a practical sense, not fearing death, but recognizing that some practical preparations needed to be made, I decided to add Angela to the savings account. The reasoning seemed sound at the time. If I became ill or unable to make decisions, Angela could access funds for medical expenses or other emergencies. What I didn't do at the time? Write out any terms or limits on how the account could be used. I trusted the implicit understanding that Angela knew this was the Africa Fund and not an ordinary family reserve. I trusted goodwill, and this is the practical lesson I want to state clearly. Goodwill and implicit understanding are not replacements for written documentation when money is involved. Not because your family members are bad people, Angela is not a bad person, but because circumstances change, pressures change, and what today sounds like, obviously I would never do that, can sound like I have no other choice after years of financial pressure. If I were doing it again, I would do two things. First, not add anyone's name to that account, but instead create a limited power of attorney, allowing access only in specifically listed circumstances. Second, if I still wanted a joint account, I would have a signed document from both parties stating the purpose of the account and the conditions of use. Those things sound like distrust. They aren't. They protect both sides. They protect me from what happened, and they protect Angela from being placed in a situation where she could make a worse decision than the best version of herself would make. Dorothy Mae Holloway was born in 1927 in Birmingham, Alabama, in a Methodist African-American family. She trained as a nurse at a medical college in Nashville, then moved to Oakland in 1953, when employment opportunities in the Bay Area were better than in the South. She met my father in 1954, married in 1955, the same year I was born. When my father left in 1963, my mother had no clearly good option. Raising an 8-year-old son alone on a nurse's salary, renting with no family nearby because her family was in Alabama and she had no money for travel. What she had was stable work, discipline built from childhood, and a determination that couldn't be explained by any logic except the logic of someone who had decided not to collapse. My mother raised me not by performing sacrifice as something that needed to be recognized and acknowledged. Yet she raised me by living so normally it was remarkable. Getting up early, working, cooking, checking my schoolwork, sleeping, repeating. No complaining, without letting the real difficulties of life become an excuse for not doing what needed to be done. I didn't know what she had endured until I was old enough to look back and calculate. A nurse's salary in Oakland in the 60s and 70s, rent, living costs for 2 people, my partial college tuition, and everything else she never listed. She didn't talk about money the way people talk about burden. She talked about money the way people talk about something that needs practical management, not lamentation. One time only I saw her cry about money. When I was 16, when an unexpected medical bill nearly drained her account. I stood in the doorway, watching her sit at the kitchen table with papers in front of her, her shoulders slightly shaking. She didn't know I was watching. The next morning, she got up as usual, made coffee, and told me to study because there was a test next week. I never forgot that night and that next morning. Not because it was harsh, life is difficult sometimes, that's reality, but because I saw in it something I wouldn't have a name for until later. The self-respect of someone who knows she is doing the right thing even when no one is guaranteeing the outcome will be good. In 2013, when she died at 86 in Kaiser Hospital in Oakland, I sat beside her bed for several days at the end. She was lucid almost until the very last. One afternoon, she looked at me and said, "Richard, I know you still want to go to Africa." I startled, not because she knew that, but because she suddenly said it out loud after so many years without mentioning it. "You've known since when?" "Since you told me about the book in 2008, she said. "You didn't think I was listening, but I was." She was quiet for a moment. "Go, Richard. When I'm no longer here, go. You don't need to be here taking care of me." That made me cry. The first time I had cried in front of her in many years. Not from sadness, but because of the kind of person she was. Even then, even knowing she was dying, what she wanted to say to me was about my future, not her grief. "Mom, I don't have enough money yet," I said. "Then save more," she said gently in the tone of someone who didn't see why this was complicated. "I have a little money left, and take it and use it for that." My mother's $40,000 was the first seed of the Africa Fund. The letter she wrote alongside it was what I held in my hands that Monday morning, sitting looking at the 0 on the phone screen. Patricia Ngo had her office on Geary Boulevard. A second-generation Vietnamese-American attorney, 53 years old, specializing in civil law and family property disputes. I found her through a former colleague at Galileo, Marcus Washington, who had used her to handle an inheritance dispute with siblings after his mother died. Wednesday, September 17th, at 10 in the morning, I sat in Patricia Ngo's neat office and told her everything. Nothing left out. From the joint account to the transaction, to the call with Angela, to the thread about Lily. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me. Do you have any documentation of that transaction? I printed the bank statement this morning. I placed the paper on the desk. I recorded the Tuesday phone call with my daughter. California is a two-party consent state, but I notified her at the start of the call that I was recording. Patricia looked at me with an expression of measured respect. You thought ahead. I taught biology for 34 years, I said. Evidence is what you gather before drawing conclusions. She gave a brief smile, then returned to professional mode. Legally, your situation is clearer than you think. A joint account does not mean the co-account holder has the right to withdraw the entire balance for their own personal purposes without the other party's consent, particularly when it can be demonstrated that the funds in the account were contributed solely by you and intended for a defined purpose. I can demonstrate that, I said. I have pension statements, salary records from Galileo, and a 10-year history of transfers into that account. Not once did Angela contribute to it. Every deposit came from me. Good. That reinforces the argument that this was your asset despite the joint title. Patricia made notes. How far do you want to take this? I had been thinking about that question for 2 days. I want the full amount back. I don't want my daughter in prison. But I want this to have real consequences, not just an apology. What does real consequences mean to you? Every cent returned. Not all at once. I understand they don't have $500,000 to repay immediately. But through a wage garnishment plan with legal binding force, one that can't simply be stopped. I paused. And I want to change my will. She's no longer the heir in my current will. The will is your right and unrelated to this civil case, Patricia said. You can change it whenever you want. Regarding the lawsuit, a freeze on their assets is the first step to prevent them from moving money before the court rules. I'll file the motion this Friday. And Lily? This was the hardest part. She threatened to stop me from seeing my granddaughter. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Hear me clearly on this. Threatening to use your access to a granddaughter as leverage in a financial dispute is behavior courts view very seriously, particularly when there is a recording. She looked at me. In the recording you have, did she say that explicitly? Explicitly. Keep that recording. It may matter if she actually follows through on that threat. When I came to Patricia's office for the first time, I wasn't someone who had never been to a lawyer. I had signed house paperwork, had a will done, handled a few small matters over the years. But this was the first time I was seeing an attorney because of a dispute with someone I loved. And that was different. Patricia handled that in what I think was the right way. She didn't treat me as a victim who needed comforting, nor as a client who needed to be persuaded to hire her. She treated me as an adult facing a problem who needed accurate information to make a decision. How far do you want to take this? She asked. That was not the question of a lawyer trying to get a contract signed, but the question of someone who wanted to understand the actual goal before talking strategy. And I had spent 2 days thinking about that question before coming to see her. Not because the answer was complicated, but because I wanted to be certain I knew what I wanted rather than letting the emotions of the moment lead me. I want the money back, I said, in a way that has real consequences but doesn't destroy my daughter's life. I want her to learn something from this, not only feel punished. Patricia nodded. Those two objectives don't conflict. Structured consequences, wage garnishment over time, create the conditions for learning, because every month the person sees the financial result of the decision they made. Furthermore, she continued, you recorded the phone call and announced it in advance. That wasn't accidental. You had prepared. That matters not just legally, but psychologically. You're not someone who was blindsided and reacting. You're someone who knew what they had and knew what they were doing. I didn't think of what I had done as particularly remarkable, and it was only basic logic to me. But Patricia was right. Many people in similar situations react from emotion, call their daughter and yell, post about it on social media, do things that make the case more complicated than it needs to be, and never get the money back. Preparation is not built in a day. It's built from the way you live and think across your whole life. 34 years of teaching biology taught me, before drawing conclusions, gather evidence. Before reacting, fully understand the situation. That isn't a principle of teaching, and it's the principle of clear thinking. Friday, September 19th, Patricia filed for a temporary asset freeze order. California's expedited legal process allows this when there is clear evidence of an improper withdrawal and a risk of further asset dissipation. Monday, September 22nd, Angela and Derek received the legal notice. Angela called me at 3 that afternoon. This time her voice was different. Not the prepared defense tone of the previous Tuesday. This was the voice of someone who had just realized the situation was more serious than they thought. "You're actually suing me, Dad?" "I'm taking the legal steps necessary to recover money I accumulated over 34 years," I said. "You destroy my life over $500,000? I thought about how to answer that, not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I wanted to say exactly what needed to be said, in exactly the right way. "Angela, no one is destroying your life. The consequences of withdrawing my money were created by you, not by me. I'm not suing you for revenge or to cause harm. I'm exercising my legal right to recover my own assets. I needed that money to save my marriage. No one asked you to save your marriage with money taken from me without asking. If you keep going, I'll—" "Angela," I interrupted gently, "I'm recording this phone call, and I'll record every future one. I notified you in advance last time. I'm notifying you again now. If you continue to make threats about Lily, that recording will be part of the legal file." There was a long pause. "You don't have to do that," Angela said, her voice lower. "I don't want to do that," I said. But I will if I need to." She hung up. I sat in the living room looking out the window. Not the bay window anymore, but the living room window looking onto the inner Richmond Street, the small street with its linden trees and local shops. The house Angela grew up in, where she and Linda and I had eaten dinner together every day for 18 years. I didn't feel satisfaction. Didn't feel like I'd won. Only something heavy and sad and necessary all at once. Marcus Washington is someone I want to talk about separately because he wasn't only the person who referred the attorney to me. Marcus and I taught at Galileo at overlapping times for about 15 years. He taught history, I taught biology, and we ate lunch together often enough that I knew he was someone I could be straight with. Not straight in the sense of sharing feelings, but that wasn't the kind of men we were, but straight in the sense of saying what we thought without fear of judgment. When I told Marcus about Angela and the account on Wednesday morning before going to meet Patricia, we were sitting in the dim sum place on Broadway, and I told him everything. Marcus listened without interrupting. One of the things I valued in him, a listener who didn't interrupt. When I finished, "Ian," he said, "are you going to sue?" "I'm considering it," I said. "You should," he said directly. "Not because of the money, though the money is real and matters, but because if you don't, you're telling Angela that what she did was acceptable. And you're telling yourself that your plan isn't important enough to protect." That sentence, "you're telling yourself that your plan isn't important enough to protect," is the one I remember most from that entire period. Not because it was legally or financially remarkable, but because it was true in the way I needed to hear from someone outside my own head. Marcus was the one who later told the story to the Galileo community. Not because I hadn't asked. He told it because, in his words, this is the kind of story people need to hear when they're in similar situations and don't know what they can do. Among the money the community contributed to the Africa Fund, Marcus Washington sent $5,000, the largest single contribution. With the note, "This is from me and from all the students we taught across 34 years. Go, Richard." I don't know how to thank that, except by doing what I said I would do. The legal mediation session took place in late October, in the office of a mediator both parties agreed to appoint. Not a courtroom with wooden benches and a gavel, Just a formal conference room with a long table and blue upholstered chairs. Angela came alone. Derek wasn't present, and I learned from Patricia that this was deliberate. Derek's absence from mediation signaled his refusal of personal accountability. Angela sat across from me and Patricia with her attorney, a man named Wilson, well-suited and looking like someone who knew he was on the weaker side. The mediator, a woman named Torres, 60 years old with the direct manner of someone who had sat in many rooms like this, read a summary of the situation and asked both parties if they wanted to say anything before getting into the specifics. Angela spoke. She talked about the financial pressure, about Derek's debt, about the fear of losing the house. Her voice trembled at points, not performance trembling, I recognize that, but the real trembling of someone carrying something genuinely heavy. I sat and listened and didn't interrupt. When my turn came, I didn't say much. I saved that money across 34 years to carry out a volunteer teaching plan in Kenya. Not an impulsive plan, one I had been building and had taken specific steps toward for 16 years. I did not give that money to my daughter, and I did not consent to her withdrawing it. I want it back. Mediator Torres looked from me to Angela to Wilson. On the legal basis, Mr. Holloway's argument has clear standing. The practical question is whether Angela Holloway Marsh is able to pay in a lump sum or needs a repayment plan. No ability to pay in a lump sum, Wilson said quickly. The money was used to settle debts. Where was it transferred? Patricia asked. Payment to the creditors of Marsh Development. Patricia set a document on the table, the result of an investigation she had conducted over the preceding month. Marsh Development, LLC filed for bankruptcy in August, but the amount withdrawn from Mr. Holloway's account was on September 12th, 30 days after the company had already filed for bankruptcy. This wasn't payment to company creditors, this was a personal payment. Wilson and Angela exchanged a look. That may have more complex legal implications, Patricia continued, but we don't necessarily need to go in that direction if there's a reasonable agreement reached today. The mediation agreement was signed in late November, after 3 weeks of negotiation through Patricia and Wilson. First, a 20% monthly wage garnishment of Angela's salary for 12 years. Based on her current salary, this was sufficient to repay the full $500,000 with a small amount of interest. The agreement carried legal binding force and could not be unilaterally canceled. Second, if Angela changed jobs, the garnishment clause would transfer to the new employer by court order. Third, the joint account was closed. I signed the agreement. Angela signed. Her hand wasn't shaking, I noticed. That was good. I didn't want her to sign from fear. I wanted her to sign because she understood. After the mediation session ended and everyone had stood up, Angela and I stood in the hallway outside the conference room, both of us holding our coats and not knowing who would leave first. Dad, she said, not looking directly at me. Do you hate me? I thought about the question for a few seconds. No, I said, honestly. But I'm very sad, and I need time to understand what happened and why. I needed the money, she said. I had nowhere else to go. Angela, I said, I gave you $20,000 last year. $20,000 I could give without feeling that it was taking away my own future. $500,000 is not something I could give because it's everything I had left for the only plan I still have for the rest of my life. If you had asked me, I would have said no. Not because I don't love you, but because the right answer was no. But you didn't ask, you took. She was quiet. The difference between asking and taking is a difference I cannot overlook, I said. Not out of rigidity, but because if I overlook it, I'm teaching you that that line doesn't matter. Angela looked at me for the first time in that conversation. I couldn't read her expression. She was thinking many things at once, and none of them were clear enough to recognize. Lily, she said finally, I won't keep Lily away from you. I believe you, I said. And I said it because I genuinely did. Not because Angela had proved it, but because I chose to believe it, and set a clear limit that if that trust was violated, there would be consequences. We walked out the building door and separated on the sidewalk. No embrace, nothing fully resolved, but not an ending in the sense of there being nothing more. I need to tell more fully what happened when Marcus Washington shared my story with the former Galileo community, because it speaks to something important about the kind of asset no one can withdraw from your account. When Marcus shared the story in the Galileo alumni chat group, what happened wasn't charitable giving in the ordinary sense. What happened was people began sharing their own stories. A retired teacher named Sarah Cho, who taught math at Galileo for 20 years, wrote that she also had a plan to go volunteer teach in Guatemala and had been talked out of it by family as not practical. Another teacher named Darnell Reed wrote about a music project in Oakland he had abandoned because he hadn't felt able to protect the time and money for it. My story wasn't special, not it was only the clearest version, with a specific dollar amount and legal action, of what many people in that community had experienced in different and quieter ways. The people who sent money weren't doing charity in the ordinary sense. They were saying, your story matters, your plan matters, and we want to be part of it. That is a kind of solidarity I hadn't expected and couldn't have planned. Sarah Cho sent me $1,000 with the message, "This is my contribution to what you're doing in Kenya, and I'm going to Guatemala next year." Your story reminded me that not practical is usually just someone else's way of saying, I don't understand why this matters to you. Darnell Reed sent $500 and wrote, I'm restarting the Oakland Music Project this fall, and thank you for not letting them stop you. I don't think my story inspired anyone in any special way. I think it only reminded those people of something they already knew, but needed to hear again from someone outside their own heads. That what genuinely matters to you needs to be protected, even when that's difficult. I want to say more about Derek Marsh. Not to judge him, but because I think it matters to understand the full story. Marsh Development LLC, from what I learned through Patricia and public records, was one of many small commercial real estate development firms in the Bay Area. The kind heavily dependent on short-term borrowed capital and investor relationships. The kind where a market turn in the wrong direction can make everything collapse quickly. Derek wasn't a criminal in the legal sense, at least not in this matter. He was someone who had made bad business decisions, hadn't told Angela until the situation was too severe, and when money was needed, he tended to look to Angela for solutions, rather than face the problem other ways. What troubled me most wasn't Derek. He is who he is, and I have no right to change that. While what troubled me was the question, if I had spoken more directly to Angela about what I was observing back in 2017, would she have listened? The honest answer is possibly not. When someone is inside a relationship and someone outside raises concerns, the usual response is to defend it. And when that person is a father, the response is even stronger because it becomes a story about family limits. But possibly not isn't certainly not. And whatever the answer would have been, I'll never know because I chose silence to avoid conflict. That is one of the things I look back on most clearly. Not that I said the wrong thing, but that I said too little and too late. The lesson isn't always speak every concern immediately. That isn't healthy communication. It's when you have an important concern about someone you love, say it once, eye clearly without circling around it, and let them know you said it because you care, not to control them. After that, the decision is theirs, but at least you said it. I'll never know whether that would have changed anything. But I know that next time I won't choose silence for the sake of comfort. I want to talk about Lily. Not about a grandfather's love for his granddaughter, but about the practical question I had to face. When an adult uses a child as a weapon in an adult dispute, what is the best thing to do? Angela's threat, if you sue me, I'll stop you from seeing Lily, isn't rare in family disputes. Child psychologists and family law attorneys call it using children as leverage, and it tends to harm the child more than the adults, because the child has no role in the dispute, but is placed in the middle of it. When Angela said it, my first reaction was pain. The pain of hearing that someone you love is willing to use a small child to get what they want. But the second reaction, more important, was recognizing that I needed to handle this in a way that protected Lily, not in a way that reacted to my own pain. That's why I announced clearly to Angela that I would be recording the calls, not to use as an immediate legal weapon, but to create a clear line. Angela knew that if she continued threatening in that direction, the recording would be legal evidence. That didn't prevent her from following through, but it created a clear legal risk sufficient to change her calculation. I also understood that I couldn't fully control access to Lily. Parents have legal authority over that, and unless there's evidence the child is being harmed, courts don't intervene. What I could control was continuing to be a stable, trustworthy presence in Lily's life through whatever means I had, through letters, through phone calls, through being there when she and her mother were ready. 6 months after I arrived in Kenya, Lily was still sending me letters. Angela was still allowing that. I don't know how this will change over time. There's no way to know. But I know that if I had backed down out of fear of losing Lily, what I would be teaching Lily, even at 9 without her fully understanding, is that threats are a valid way to get what you want from people who love you. That is not the lesson I want to teach my granddaughter. Limits don't only protect the person who sets them, they teach the people around them, including children who are watching, about how human beings should treat each other. In December, I sat with Patricia to update my will, not from anger or to punish Angela. I had been thinking about this before the lawsuit began, and actually before Angela even withdrew the money. The old will, written in 2009, left everything to Angela and a small portion to Linda. The new will I wanted to be different in a considered way. I want to leave the bulk of my estate to the Kenyan education organization I'm working with, I told Patricia. A small amount, I guess about $20,000, left to Lily when she turns 18, and another small portion to several former students of mine who need support for graduate school. Nothing to Angela? Patricia asked, not to challenge, just to confirm. Nothing to Angela, I said. Not because I don't love my daughter, but because I have already given her what I was able to give: time, attention, money when I could. And my limit is there. What remains after I'm gone should go to places that will use it in keeping with what I did my whole life. Education. Patricia nodded and began drafting. Do you also want to include your reasoning? No, I said. A will doesn't need explanation. It's my decision, and I've thought it through carefully. The new will was signed on December 20th, 5 days before Christmas. I didn't tell Angela about it, not to hide it. If she asked, I would tell her honestly. But because this was my decision about my own assets, and I didn't need anyone's approval or agreement. That Christmas, I had dinner with Angela and Lily. Lily brought me a hand-drawn picture, a giraffe standing beside a small school because she knew her grandpa was going to Africa. Grandpa will teach here, she had written underneath in still uneven capitals. I put the picture on the kitchen table and didn't put it away. Angela and I didn't talk much at that dinner, but we weren't silent in the tense way. We were silent in the way of two people slowly relearning how to be together after saying things that can't be taken back and doing things that can't be erased. Not a happy ending in the movie sense, but something real. March 15th, 2025, San Francisco International Airport at 4 in the morning with 2 suitcases and a carry-on bag. No one was seeing me off. I didn't want that. Not because I didn't have people who would have wanted to come, but because I wanted this moment to be my own. After 69 years, after everything that had happened in the past 9 months, I wanted to sit in the airport at 4 in the morning with 2 suitcases and feel that this was something actually happening. Not a plan, not a dream, but real. The Africa Fund no longer held $500,000. I had begun receiving repayments under the garnishment plan from December, a portion each month exactly as agreed. But I couldn't wait 12 years to have enough money before going. I didn't have 12 years to wait. Yet what had happened in the 2 months after the ruling was something I hadn't anticipated. My old community at Galileo High. Marcus Washington, the colleague who had referred Patricia Ngo to me, shared my story with other teachers and alumni. Not to raise donations, he just told it because we used to share life stories with each other. But from there, over 2 months, I received dozens of messages and emails from old acquaintances. Many of them sent money. Not because I had asked. I never asked. but because they knew the story and wanted to be part of it. Former students from 30 years ago, colleagues from my first years of teaching, friends of friends I had never met. By February, the Africa Fund held about $180,000. Not as much as the original plan, but enough to begin. The Kenya organization knew my situation and adjusted the plan. I would come for 2 years instead of 5, with a more realistic budget. 2 years, I accepted. At 4:15 on the morning of March 15th, sitting at Gate G at SFO, I took out the pale yellow envelope. Read my mother's letter one last time. Not because I needed to read it, but because this was the moment I wanted her here in the most concrete sense possible. "Mom, I'm going," I said quietly. "Later than planned. Less money than planned, but I'm going." I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, into the carry-on bag. Not the suitcase, the carry-on, close to my body. At 6 in the morning, Kenya Airways flight KQ-101 began its scheduled departure. I arrived in Nairobi after 24 hours of travel with a layover in Amsterdam. The person who met me at the airport was Daniel Mwangi, coordinator of the education organization I had been working with remotely for 10 years. A 38-year-old man with a wide smile and an old Toyota with unreliable air conditioning. "Professor Richard," Daniel shook my hand firmly and walked me to the car. "We've had everything ready for you." Kamau School, the school I had visited in 2015, was an hour-and-a-half drive from Nairobi. Red dirt roads, green fields, and air completely unlike San Francisco. Warmer, drier, with something in the Kenyan afternoon light I couldn't describe. The first time I stood in front of a class at Kamau was a Monday morning the week after I arrived. 28 eighth-grade students, on 12 to 14 years old, sitting up straight and looking at me with the attentiveness I had seen for the first time 10 years earlier and never forgotten. "Good morning," I said in English. English was the language of instruction here. "My name is Professor Richard. I come from San Francisco in the United States. I taught biology for 34 years and I want to teach you." A boy in the front row raised his hand. "Why did you come here, Professor?" The simple, direct question of someone young enough not to feel they needed social pleasantries before asking what they wanted to know. "Because I wanted to teach," I said. "And because you're here." The boy nodded as though that were a completely satisfactory answer. That first class ran 2 hours. And we talked about cells. Not from a textbook, but from things the students could see and hold. A leaf, a pinch of soil, a tomato from the school garden. I had no microscope. We didn't have microscopes yet. That would come once I contacted some of the donors I had been reaching out to from the United States. But we had hands and eyes and questions. After class, when the students had gone outside, I sat in the empty room and looked at the blackboard still full of cell diagrams I had drawn in chalk. A small space, low corrugated metal roof, sunlight coming through windows without glass, only wooden frames and thin mesh. I thought, this is why. Not in the sense that this was the happy ending of a sad story, but in the sense that this was the thing I had known since 2008 when I read that book alone in the living room. And the thing I had not been wrong about. This was something important enough to build an entire life toward and important enough to protect when it needed protecting. When I arrived in Kenya, I thought I knew what I was there to do. Teach biology, support local teachers, contribute to the organization. I knew all of that, and it was all true. What I didn't know was that I would learn more than I taught. Wanjiku, the teacher I had seen in 2015 and the first person I collaborated with when I arrived this year, taught me that in the simplest way, by asking questions. She was 39, had taught at Kamau for 12 years, and had a way of asking questions about teaching methods that made me reconsider much of what I thought I already knew. "Professor Richard," she said after my first class, "you teach very well, but why do you ask many questions that only have one right answer?" I stopped. "Yeah, what do you mean?" "When you ask how many types of cells are there, there's only one right answer, and the students know it. That question tests whether they remember, not whether they're thinking." She said this not to criticize, but to ask genuinely, and that manner gave the question a different weight. Could you ask more questions that might have several possible right answers? I sat with that for a while. After 34 years of teaching, someone I had come to support was pointing out something I wasn't doing well. And that didn't make me defensive. It made me pay attention because she was right. Wanjiku and I began genuinely collaborating from the second week. Not me teaching her, but both of us designing lessons together. She contributing knowledge about the specific circumstances of students here, and I contributing knowledge about hands-on teaching methods I had developed over years. The results were much better than if I had simply applied what I'd done in San Francisco. Daniel Mwangi told me in the third month, Professor Richard, some people come here to teach, and some come to learn and teach. You are the second kind. That's why this program is working better. I thought about that many times afterward. The difference between coming to teach and coming to learn and teach isn't about knowledge or competence. It's about attitude. The person who comes to teach brings answers. The person who comes to learn and teach brings questions. I had spent 69 years developing good questions for the profession of teaching. And what I learned in Kenya was that the best question I could ask was still the simplest. What matters most to this student? In June, 3 months after arriving in Kenya, I received an envelope from San Francisco, sent by Angela. But the writing on the front was Lily's, large and tilted in the way of a 9-year-old learning cursive. Inside was a letter from Lily, 4 pages of lined paper, big, careful handwriting, telling about school, about the family cat, about learning to swim and being close to making it 10 meters. And on the last page, one question. Has Grandpa seen a real giraffe yet? I sat on the porch of the small house the organization had arranged for me. A red brick house, corrugated roof, a small yard out back with a banana tree and a papaya tree, and read the letter 3 times. I wrote a reply. By hand, on paper. Not email, because I wanted Lily to receive something you could hold. I told her about Kamau School, about the students there, about the first time I taught about cells using leaves and pinches of soil. And at the end I wrote, Grandpa hasn't seen a real giraffe yet, but last week I saw an antelope run across the field near the school in the early morning. I took a photo, but it came out a little blurry. I'll keep trying. Grandpa loves Lily. I folded the letter, put it in an envelope, wrote Angela and Lily's address in Marin County. Daniel drove me to the county post office on Friday. Angela and I exchanged short messages each month. Not deep conversations, just updates. She's fine. Lily's fine. The garnishment is running on schedule. Not a father-daughter relationship in any ideal sense. But the relationship is still there, and that matters more than many other things. I don't know what will happen between Angela and me in the years ahead. I don't know if Derek and Angela will stay together or not. Don't know if Angela will look back at what she did and see something differently after time has passed. Those things lie outside my control, and I've learned not to try to control them. What I can control is I'm here, I'm teaching, and the pale yellow envelope is in the drawer of the small desk beside Lily's giraffe drawing. September, 6 months after arriving in Kenya, I look back and see what has changed and what hasn't. What has changed? Kamau School has 2 microscopes and a basic biology lab kit, funded by a science education organization I contacted in April. My class now has 28 regular students and about 10 unofficial ones, kids from other classrooms who slip by the window to watch and listen. Daniel told me that's a good sign. Wanjiku and I have developed a set of hands-on teaching materials for 7th and 8th grade science. Not academic materials, but practical ones, designed for circumstances without much equipment, but with plenty of nature and questions. The organization is considering distributing those materials to 12 other schools in Kiambu County. Yadi Amara, the 13-year-old who asked about bacteria because her mother was ill, is now studying basic immunology and has presented a short report to the class on how the body fights bacteria. The report was better prepared than many I received from high school students at Galileo. What hasn't changed? I still wake at 5:30 and drink Kenyan coffee. The Arabica that Daniel brings each week from a farm in Thika, coffee that is dark and fragrant in a way completely different from the peats I drank for 30 years in San Francisco. I still think about my mother on mornings like these, and about the pale yellow envelope in the nightstand drawer. I still remember September 15th last year, the phone screen and the zero. Not because I want to, but because some things print themselves into memory without being invited. But that doesn't define my today. My today is the 8 o'clock class. Amara with her notebook full of notes, Wanjiku with the new curriculum materials we're finalizing, and Daniel with his old Toyota and unreliable air conditioning driving me to school every morning. That is today, and that is enough. And I write these words on a September evening, sitting on the porch of the small house in Kiambu County, Kenya, listening to frogs and the wind across the fields. 6 months since arriving here, 80 days of students, 3 local teachers I've been supporting with supplementary hands-on science methods, and last week the first 2 microscopes arrived at Kamau School, funded by a science education organization I had been contacting since April. Looking back at the past year, there are things I want to say, not as moral lessons, but as the true account of someone who has lived through it. The first is about joint accounts. This is a practical and important point. Adding someone's name to an account doesn't mean that person has the right to use the money for their own personal purposes. If you need someone to be able to access your account in an emergency, there are other legal options. Conditional powers of attorney, accounts with limited access rights, that don't create the same risk as a joint account without clear terms. I learned this lesson the expensive way. The second is about limits and love. The sentence Angela said to me, "You have a pension, Dad, you don't need that much money," is one I heard many times in my head across those months. Not because it was cruel, but because it reflects a belief I think is very common, that when someone you love needs something, you're obligated to sacrifice your plans for them, that love means having no limits. That isn't true. Loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy your future. Loving someone doesn't mean nothing is yours alone and inviolable. Limits aren't selfishness. They're the condition for a healthy relationship to exist. The third is about dreams held for a long time. I held the Kenya dream for 16 years, not because I was afraid to act, but because I needed to prepare properly. During those 16 years, there were moments when others suggested I use the money for something more practical, a larger house, investments helping Angela. I didn't. Not because I didn't love Angela, but because I knew that if I didn't protect my own dream, no one would do it for me. And at 69, if not now, then when? The fourth is the hardest thing to say. Sometimes the people we love do wrong things to us. Not because they're bad people. Angela is not a bad person. But because they're under pressure, lacking judgment in an unhealthy relationship, or in a period when everything looks like logical decisions when actually they are desperate ones. Loving that person doesn't mean accepting what they did. Loving that person can mean setting clear consequences. Not to punish, but because consequences are the only way people learn that some actions cannot be accepted no matter who does them. And fifth, what I believe my mother, Dorothy May Holloway, 40-year nurse, the woman who raised me alone in a 2-bedroom Oakland apartment, understood but never said directly, life doesn't have to be what others think you should have. It is what you genuinely want and have the patience to build, the courage to protect, and the wisdom to recognize when it is being threatened. Yesterday morning, I'm a student named Amara, the 13-year-old who is the sharpest in the class, came to find me after the lesson and asked, "Professor, can science change our lives?" That question, the question I had heard across 38 years of teaching in many different forms, from children at Galileo High in San Francisco to children at Kamau School in Kiambu County. Science is what helps you understand how the world works, I told Amara. When you understand how something works, you can change it. You can change your life. You can change the lives of the people around you. Not always fast, not always easy, but yes. Amara nodded and went to her next class. I stood watching her walk across the red dirt schoolyard in the Kenyan midday sun. Sun unlike San Francisco sun, this is equatorial sun. Direct and unapologetic. And thought that this was what I had been looking for since 2008 when I read that book alone in the living room. Not to rescue anyone, not to change the world in some grand sense, only to be here in this classroom with real questions and real answers. Loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy your future. My mother understood that. She raised me alone without letting her love for her child soften her own limits when those limits were needed. I learned it later than she did, at greater cost, but I learned it, and now I am here.